who's the orator for Group 1? Perfect. So, and do you have a flip chart, or is that, it's all up
No.
there?
It's
Perfect.
everywhere, like it's on about 5 sheets, so we'll see how it goes.
Excellent, very good. All right.
All right.
So, Chris,
Okay, well, we had a very interesting discussion, not quite enough time to get into all these questions, but I guess, we certainly talked a little bit about technology and some of the things we've already mentioned, the internet and connectivity, although obviously still some challenges some places with that in terms of cost and availability. Other things in terms of the field work we do and technology in terms of GPS and high-resolution satellite data, underwater archaeology methods, different kinds of things like that that are available now that maybe weren't 20 years ago or so. So part of our time, we definitely talked about some of those technological changes. Another sort of big theme, I guess, that we talked about was in the NSF lingo, the broader impacts. So the kind of shift, and I don't know exactly what year the broader impacts was explicitly put into the proposals, but maybe a shift kind of from just lip service to broader impacts to actually trying to take more seriously, trying to make these meaningful as something that's changed over the last 20 years. And so kind of included in that, we've seen more public sharing, more realization among scientists, social scientists, that we need to make the research accessible, although we talked about how that still needs a lot of work to make the language accessible and understandable. We talked a little bit about empowering communities through allowing them, or them being able to collect the data themselves and interpret it themselves and analyze it themselves. And certainly a lot of our discussion talked about working with Indigenous people and how that is certainly not new and has been going on in many places for a long time. But we have now some great examples of it being done well, although in many cases the discourse on working together might be ahead of the practice, and there's still logistical limitations in certain times. Discoveries, we certainly talked about a couple things here and there, some of the new archaeological work in terms of ideas about how people got to the Americas, and but we didn't talk too much about specific discoveries, I'd say. I think we spent more of our time talking about trends in the last 20 years. One of the things that came up was the explosion of data. So, and the data management needs that we're becoming more explicit in understanding we need to think about archiving these data, not just making them accessible now, but thinking about the future and whether those will be accessible. We talked about another trend, the increased melding in natural and social sciences. So increased interdisciplinary work within natural science, within social scientists, but between as well. Another trend we touched upon is making research relevant to policy is something that's probably increased in the last 20 years. We discussed a little bit about the kind of politicization of science in this country, and the scrutiny that science is, of what is being funded, what's not being funded, whether that should be funded, as something that has increased recently. Another trend, we talked about the emphasis on change, as in the first question, the changing Arctic, and question 2, changes in Arctic social science. So we were, wondered what hasn't changed, and is this something we also need to consider? And the need for social science to study how these changes are affecting people. So technology, obviously, but other things as well. And I guess the last trend we identified was just urgency in everything, urgency in, getting, learning about these things and communicating them. Anything else that we talked about lots of other things, but those are some of the main ones. Yeah.
just use this?
That'd be great.
All right. This is on, I take it?
Seems to be on.
Okay. All right, let me make sense of these notes here. I think a lot of what I'll say here is going to replicate what was just said. In our discussion, we pulled out, I think very succinctly, two primary themes that have to do with changes over the last 20 years to Arctic social science, and those involve technology in a number of different ways. One of them being that the technological advances have allowed us to be much more efficient in our field work, which is horrifying to say with the funder in our group, that we can do more with less. Right, so strike that from the record. But there are some significant advances and advantages to being able to do things that we couldn't do 20 years ago, both in terms of the ability to store and analyze data and, to engage in data analysis in the field, simply because of the computing power that's available, or even the technological capabilities of being, connected globally, so that, not only is it about sort of research and raw data, but it's about disseminating research results quickly and easily, and connecting people to other academic sources or to other sources that they might not have access to. So that's certainly one advantage of the technology. The capabilities to engage in research that's less invasive and damaging. And so the archaeologists among us were quick to point out that sort of advances in remote sensing technology and other kinds of sort of analysis allow for, non-invasive excavations of understanding that things are there, which ameliorates the problems of excavating things and also storing the material somewhere. And a third here, let me look through my morass of notes. I think the other that the technology allows is, in addition to the toolkits, it allows for easier dissemination of results back to communities in various different ways. The second theme that we, very quickly pulled out had to do with what we decided to call enlightenment. That has changed rather dramatically over the past 20 years. Not in the sense that we were living in the dark ages and were bad people 20 years ago, but certain things that never occurred to us occur now, and those have to do partly with decolonization processes and changes in power dynamics, but also with increasing concerns about engaging communities in research that wants to be done. The very things that we talked about with co-production earlier. So the issues of human dignity and equality and power and respect are the kinds of things that have changed over 20 years. So is there anything else that I'm missing? My group? You catch all of that? Okay. Good.
Thank you.
Yep.
Good thoughts and very efficient.
Yeah, that was great.
Yes,
All about
impressive. So our group had the benefit of having people at all stages of career, so some longer than others. So we had quite an interesting perspective over the 20 years. We came up with 4 major changes that we've seen. The first is that 20 years ago, really large multidisciplinary groups did not exist the way they do now, in the way that they include social sciences, maybe not prioritize social science, but certainly include them. And this has, of course, increased networking. Communication is up among disciplines and therefore with communities also. The second is within social sciences themselves, we've seen great diversification. We're addressing questions that are now far outside of just traditional anthropology. And we thought perhaps, and we wanted to confirm this with Anna, this is sort of exemplified by the existence of an Arctic social science division at NSF, one that's geographically bounded on this particular topic. And perhaps unique, so that we can see funding in the discipline actually developing together. The third is similar to what we just heard. We have much easier physical access to the region. Logistics tend to be easier. That doesn't mean we need less money to get there, which of course is related to communication, the presence of the internet, the virtual relationships that we talked about this morning, and all of that provides us earlier access to communities, and communities have earlier access to us in the planning process for research. And then the fourth major change we identified was, of course, what we've already heard about today, the autonomy of Indigenous groups who've really advanced the way that we collaborate, make us accountable for what we do and the questions we ask, and also in some cases provide the permits for the work that we do. And that led us directly to some of the results or changes that we saw, first of which, of course, is Indigenous participation in that knowledge production that drives sort of a common understanding of the research that we do. The second we talked about, since there were quite a few archaeologists in our group, were the prevalence of climate proxy data that are available to us now. They're incredibly detailed. We have advanced modeling techniques we can rely on. And all of this is very collaborative, but we agreed that this was both for the good, meaning that we've increased our knowledge of the past and the temporal and spatial resolution we have access to, but also potentially negative in that we don't always speak the language that these scientists speak, and we don't always know how to incorporate that information effectively, nor do they know how to do the opposite. Third, we all agreed that we're pushing the envelopes in our own disciplines by taking this interdisciplinary approach, but in many cases, traditional academia doesn't understand that interdisciplinary approach. And Igor said very nicely, we're haunted by the unchanged nature of our backyard. And that led us to talk about historical ecology in terms of environmental anthropology and environmental archaeology, which is now serving as a really productive framework for collaboration. And as somebody said, responding to a sense of urgency in many places across the Arctic. And then finally, part C, why these changes matter. Leading from that historical ecology perspective, for those of us who are archaeologists and who take a paleo perspective, we really can't understand environmental change without looking at this long-term record and understanding variability over a huge time frame to inform the present. And related to that, political scientists, historians, archaeologists, and anthropologists really now can find a common language, particularly in the Arctic, where the past is so present today. Third, sort of transitioning to political science, because we were lucky to have a political scientist in our group, we're reaching critical points of decision-making that need to be collaborative. We must engage with all stakeholders, which we already defined today throughout the day, to have this sort of inclusive decision-making process. And then finally, the last 2 points, the social sciences we felt can help provide leverage and power for communities via this knowledge generation from a variety of disciplines, and sort of thinking about information as power as we move forward. And then lastly, related to all of this, social science has over the long term really helped, we thought as a group, facilitate the importance of Indigenous perspectives in scientific research and in these big multidisciplinary projects, and has helped to bring these Indigenous perspectives into the wider public and make them more acceptable as other ways of knowing. That's what we had.
I was going to use our notes to talk through this. Can everyone hear me, or should I use one of the maybe perhaps not totally functional microphones?
Give it a try, otherwise
Should I?
we won't be
Okay.
able to kill it.
Is it on? No.
If the green button is on, it may be on.
Now it's on, I think.
All right.
And I'll probably not be able to use my written notes. Well, we were really struck in looking at the first question just about the degree to which the Arctic has sort of coalesced as a region of study that is sort of recognized in a larger context and sort of global sweep, and as such sort of has given those of us who do Arctic social science sort of increased comparative platform for making sort of arguments that cross-cut lots of different fields and issue areas and sort of thematic and theoretical discussions as well over the last many years. And also, you know, the folks in our group who've actually seen these changes happen were reflecting on that in their own personal experience, which is an interesting, you know, point of discussion as well. We also noted that, in the earlier days, a lot of these conversations were happening in area-specific journals, and the growth of different new technologies and search engines have actually created more access to those kinds of contributions and have sort of emphasized their applicability in wider domains than those had originally when they were first published. So that's something that's changed markedly in the last 20 years. Like many other groups, we really emphasized the technologies that are now widespread in a lot of the research that we all do, specifically geographic technologies, new data and access, and also specifically for archaeology, a variety of new technologies that have really become sort of widely practiced, changing access to different sorts of geographical regions, questions about whether that access will remain, specifically with Russia, were also a topic of conversation for us. And also not only data across disciplines and across geographical space, but also across time and the temporal dimension, and sort of being able to visualize and see different sorts of historical change over time, and the degree to which certain sorts of long-term perspectives might be necessary in answering certain questions is now a little bit more visible and evident based on these new sort of technologies, including big data. I also maybe I was probably the most cynical in asking, like, are we sure that all of these changes are necessary? We're actually using them to answer the right questions. But nevertheless, we all really noted that these have significantly changed how we do our work. And I think there might be even some other, we kept talking about this. We have more on the next page. Obviously, also the funding for international research collaboration was a really striking aspect of the changes that we noted, as well as has been talked about, I think, by all the other groups thus far, the imperative to think in complicated ways about ethical practices and codes of conduct as we do our research. That's become integrated into the everyday practice of our work. As well. And so we have some other points on that. In the second question, we really focused a lot on this question of interdisciplinarity and how difficult it is oftentimes. We both noted its significance, its growth, its importance, its the degree to which we all sort of recognize this as something that needs to happen, but also the complexities of that, asking questions about the what kind of language becomes the sort of lingua franca of interdisciplinary work. It reminds me of our conversation about co-production, whose sort of knowledges become the way in which those conversations happen and are communicated, and how we push for sort of more genuine forms of co-production, both across sort of scientific and indigenous knowledge and those categories, but even within the social sciences, obviously, and between the natural and social sciences. And we really emphasized also something that was mentioned by someone else before, the challenges and disjunctures between funders' priorities oftentimes and the problem-focused research that might get done, and the sort of older institutional cultures of our university systems and tenure and promotion, for example, and how oftentimes we see a variety of barriers, both in terms of the sort of research that's rewarded internally within our disciplines, and even the sort of prominence of new technologies like citation indices and journal rankings, which increasingly actually sort of block different sorts of interdisciplinarity, and we see this all the time. So recognizing those challenges that might keep us from answering the more interesting interdisciplinary questions that arise from our co-produced knowledge. So we also had an extended conversation, which I'll try to be as crisp and brief and snappy as my fellow presenters and quickly go through these, about the ongoing importance of basic research and some of the dilemmas about directing research to policy as much as we recognized its importance. In terms of basic research, a number of us made the point that if we sort of had forsaken basic research altogether. It's not clear that we would be one step ahead of the problems that we see in the world as they arise. So that was a theme that emerged to stress the importance of continuing sort of basic or more theoretically oriented research. And even this idea about policy, we recognize, I think this was the threading the needle, someone from my group can correct me if I'm misremembering that, but that there are actually multiple different kinds of policy environments that we're working in at the same time, from multiple different national perspectives to also local policy needs. And so actually what it means to do work that's relevant for policy is in and of itself it's a complicated landscape. In terms of what we, is sort of the research that's been done in Arctic social sciences has contributed over the last 20 years. Again, this point about needing to be more proactive corresponds both to our sense of the importance of basic research that I mentioned earlier, I believe, if I'm remembering our conversation correctly, and the fact that that actually we all collectively in this room have a lot of knowledge that's perhaps not evident to those folks who are most oriented to being proactive, whether it's tourism developers who are looking to, have cruise lines circumnavigating the north, and other folks who have probably less reluctance to sort of get out there and see their visions materialized in some way in the Arctic. We also really noted that research contributions that have been significant in the Arctic have informed social science more broadly, specifically the role of the whole constellation of ideas that are linked to traditional ecological knowledge. These things are now, it's a common acronym in social sciences in general, and a lot of that research was originally developed in the Arctic. And the fact that sort of more holistic perspectives and interdisciplinary work have been really developed in the context of the North and are now recognized far more broadly in many different geographical areas and across different sort of issue areas. Likewise, it's been a site for pushing cross-cultural and international collaborations. And sort of just stepping back to reflect on the significance of this in general, as we've been discussing the whole time thus far, we obviously have a lot of, it's become a much more visible region and connected to certain sorts of issues, and that's provided both opportunities for us and also perhaps some challenges depending on what people think they know and how we might want to engage that. So I guess this is maybe, I'm not, so I guess we want to close by emphasizing that that we have this social science program that's increasingly robust, but could of course always be made more robust, and we want to emphasize the fact that the things we learn about the Arctic, given the fact that there are all these opportunities for really understanding cross-cultural exchanges and different political issues across contexts have a lot of possibility for knowledge transfer. That was our last. Anything else from our group that I missed? Okay.
I need glasses just to stand there. You probably can't see anything. Probably not helpful. Well, we had a really lively group of all women, good or bad, but I thought it was good. And I really enjoyed our conversation, actually. In terms of what are we able to do now in Arctic social sciences, we couldn't do 20 years ago. I could say that right now we're more problem-oriented. Coming from my own field, I would say in the last 20 years, there's a greater general awareness that people actually live in the Arctic. And that goes from, scientists to policymakers to the grocery store. And so as someone who does international relations, it's very helpful for that to be a generally recognized notion to help you even begin to formulate questions and actually do research. There's a greater awareness about the communities in the Arctic. So just ultimately, the landscape has changed from what we knew 20 years ago about the Arctic, and so we can kind of start much farther ahead than we could 20 years ago, basically, is what we're saying, in terms of moving forward. We also have, because of technology, and this has been brought up a lot, we have improved communication and relationships over long distances and over time that are able to be strengthened and are able to be kept, I guess, because of technology. At the same time, me talking from the top down, Arctic communities themselves have more global awareness. And so that's kind of changed the landscape in which we even begin to have conversations about the Arctic and ask questions. There's more established infrastructure. I think we were talking about more on the knowledge side, right? Kind of a knowledge infrastructure that exists now. There are better levels of communication when it comes to education and opportunities. I can't remember exactly what we're talking about there. I'll just say that. Yeah, community consultation is now considered like vital, or it's now what does that say? Community consultation not considered.
Not taken.
Is now considered, and it's not taken as seriously as before. No, that doesn't make any sense. But I would say, like, engagement with communities is more taken for granted now, and it's something that happens all the time, and it's not something that, like, you just write into a research proposal because you have to, but it's actually carried out on the ground and done in earnest. Okay, so what are we able to do? Yeah, in terms of, and so in that context, when we're talking about, you know, what we're able to do, the we has changed, right? There's no us versus them and stuff. Oftentimes, the we as a community, and I would say as an Arctic community. And so it's not a scientist versus the community. When there's a lot more ability to engage in research as a we. And so these distinctions between scientist and community and researcher and person has diluted. There's been an advancement in technology and the way that we use technology, and how the ways in which like real-time data and documentation and observation has really revolutionized because of technology. And we were talking a lot about and how technology has become like a tool. It's not in an end in of itself. And so how technology has been used in terms of creating, you know, things that would go on the snowmobiles and be tracking real-time data, and whalers, or I'm sorry, hunters have GPS systems now where they can kind of document all types of things from the birds they see to changes the environment on a daily basis. And so this kind of real-time knowledge. And so we are also talking a lot about, as scientists, we are learning a lot more about technology and how to use that technology as social scientists. And at the same time, the community members themselves are learning, and so you've got like younger generations of community of our people who, you know, community members who are much more savvy with technology than before, and so are able to grasp and use and make use of technology in ways that older community members and older scientists just cannot. And so it's kind of, it was quite a positive way of when we were talking about. Let's see, like, yeah, still facing indigenous and scientific use of technology. Yeah, and so when we were talking about challenges and upcoming challenges, it had to do a little bit with this, you know, global awareness from the local level, but also in the use of technology and how things are changing, and it's this younger generation who are going to be able to fill in the gaps. And what we see maybe as old people that are challenges, they see as, you know, oh, well, we'll just fill that gap, and more of an opportunity. So there's going to have new generations going to come up that are much more savvy. And it's kind of even, maybe in that sense, the playing field in terms of access to technology and how to use it. At the same time, there's still a lot of difficulty. The gap still remains, and it's actually maybe growing in terms of for anthropology, for anthropologists to actually know the local languages. And I'm not an anthropologist, so from what if I'm wrong, just somebody point that out. From what I'm understanding, there used to be much more time to carry out and prepare for your field research and then carry out your field research. And so that provided a great opportunity to learn local languages. And now everything is a rush, and you need to, I don't know, graduate in 3 years or something. And so there's much less ability for anthropologists actually to have, to know local languages. But ironically, at the same time, we were talking about, like in these kind of like larger international research fora, there is greater communication between like indigenous communities and the researchers themselves. So we have advanced on being able to have greater communication. Lena was talking about in the early days, community members would go out and try to, discuss about, some of the questions they have and the problems and the way and kind of the methodologies in which they understand the world. And people were just like, why, this is crazy, and falling asleep and not understanding anything. And now there's much greater communication. And so it's an odd thing because there's less indigenous language communication, but I don't know if that's just because there's more people are speaking English. I'm not sure, but it is a good thing in the sense that there's from 20 years ago, there's much more communication going on, and understanding of each other. So at the same time, social media is still principally in English, and tweets are not, or tweets, okay, are not. I'm old, really, are not necessarily, like they're not often in Greenlandic. And so when we're talking about these new technologies, whose technologies for whom, and who are we and who are they for, and who are we speaking to, and who are we excluding. And so then one of the things that we were saying, what results, discoveries, theories, and all these kind of things that there's, in a sense, we've had a process of decolonization of knowledge, but that's also led to an increasing awareness of the known unknowns. And so we know that we have a lot more that we need to know. We also decided that research more generally has become much more open-minded, and that we're actually really beginning to kind of create a fundamental shift in the way we all think. And so we could be social scientists, even policy, private sector, communities themselves. We're really starting to rethink the way that we think. But what we did note is that institutions themselves really still need to catch up to those shifts that are taking place in the ways we think, because it hasn't quite gotten there, and that provides obstacles. Okay.
Is this on? Oh, yes.
Yep.
Okay. Live. Okay. So last group. So for, I was just turning to the questions. Okay. So for A, what are we able to do now in Arctic social sciences that we could not or did not do 20 years ago? Our list is much more recent, so there are much more recent critical recognitions of Arctic social sciences, I think. And I'm not going to go through everything we talked about because a lot of it's been said, and I know we're over time. So I'm going to stick to the new stuff. First off, recognition that indigenous peoples or remote and or rural locations are not homogeneous. In other words, one of the things that we need to do that behooves us as well as these communities is to recognize that there are class and status even within indigenous communities, and we don't want to essentialize those communities in ways that prevent us from understanding them and them from understanding themselves. Second, we recognize that large collaborative ventures are very useful. And the phrase we had in our group was that we recognize in our different fields now that one person is not likely to know everything in the way you used to go to a single source text because that person knew everything. We are more humble, I think. Third, we can discuss this social ecological system concept. Now, when I wrote my dissertation in 1999 or 2000, my committee had screaming fights with one another Now, right, this idea that multiple disciplinary work is important and in fact valuable, using different assumptions, different data production, different data sets at the same time is no longer thought of as crazy. So this is a new thing, right, that's good for funding and good for results because we can use mixed and multiple methods. Next, we are not set back anymore by including people who are not academic if they're indigenous. However, right, the indigenous concept, status, identity, you can shoot me from whichever perspective you feel I've stepped in the wrong direction. But the point is that we need to also be able to recognize that there are non-indigenous marginalized people and groups also within the Arctic, and that has to also inform our research. So I'm just pointing out that we've taken great strides and taken our lessons from indigenous knowledge and acceptance, but could it also be, we left as an open question in our group, that we could begin to apply this same idea to other marginalized groups and individuals who are valuable to understanding the Arctic. The next one is technology. Just a few things that weren't mentioned or I didn't catch. Creation of new data sets and how people communicate with these new technologies. So we had examples of new DNA analysis, satellite data, right, being able to locate sites remotely, advances in chemistry. One thing talked about the prominence of the internet, the ability to share artifacts and other material culture housed in one place across vast distances. And just, I think it's interesting, so I'm going to say it, the notion that these research tools that are incredibly old have been updated, so like the microscope. Next, or still on A modern recognition of post-traumatic stress disorder. Sort of what we want to talk about is there's a very modern understanding of trauma, both from warfare and colonialization and gender studies, that is deeply important and able to inform and differentiate between different lived experiences that is valuable to the Arctic. And this is a relatively new understanding of trauma. Gender roles, and here we mean the modern understanding, the advances in social sciences of understanding gender, not just from our interests in male and female, but also in terms of the methods we use to examine gender, and beyond that to unfamiliar roles. So being able to, in the academy, look at what many in the academy view as very new, but which indigenous peoples and others have known for a very long time, are identities that might be unexpected or very different. Lastly, and this is going to be a key point, so the last thing that we're able to do now, or we recognize now that we haven't before, and I think this has owes an enormous debt to all of the social scientists and those in the humanities who worked during IPY to ensure from multiple countries that this happened. When climate and environment is on equal footing with other dynamics or narratives, for example, well-being or history or material culture recovery, we can produce better research. So one of the things we've learned is that we don't just have to talk about the Arctic in an essentialistic environmental climate change narrative. So this is our only point for B, an interest of time, and I think we just found this very important, and we had a long discussion. What results and discoveries, right, have transformed how we think about the Arctic. Arctic social sciences have begun to move away from or recognize its former dependence on an environmentally defined region, right? Climate change is not the sole driving problem on a daily scale for just about everybody who lives in the Arctic. We mean in a daily lived reality of, do your kids get to school, right? How are you going to feed yourself? What's going on? So the idea is that we're just saying that one transformation is that Arctic social sciences have been able to take it upon themselves to define problems outside of the dominant climate change narrative. And lastly, C, and this links back to these ideas of narratives. What we see, right, and how what we see the ways in which this matter is that when we can link the non-dominant narratives of the Arctic to research priorities. So admitting that we're not dependent on climate change for everything, hopefully finding funding opportunities that aren't dependent on climate change, that by engaging in these research priorities, we're going to be able to revere to the broader scientific communities, either within the Arctic or at large, much more important and highly valuable generalizable social science results and data, so that what we learn from research in the Arctic isn't just for the Arctic, right, but can be applied to the global south, and to other kinds of places. And even if it's not absolutely relevant, it can at least be compared in a manner to these other places. So we can learn more than we know when we use our social science methods without the artificial boundary of an Arctic, a lot of air quotes you can imagine. In particular, at scales where communities and peoples don't necessarily talk about putting the Arctic first, right? They don't view themselves as Arctic. That's something we come in and say that's important. And then that's it, very briefly.
Thank you very much. We are about 15 minutes over. Thank you all for holding us to tight. That's what we were when we came in.